The story of women in ancient China is one of resilience, duty, and quiet strength. Throughout history, behind emperors, scholars, and warriors, stood generations of women whose roles were deeply woven into society. Though often confined by tradition, they shaped families, influenced politics from behind the scenes, and left their mark in ways that are often overlooked. A woman's status in ancient China was largely determined by her family, social class, and the dominant philosophy of the time. In early societies, women had more autonomy, and some even held positions of political and military power. But as Confucian ideals took root, strict expectations emerged, emphasizing obedience, virtue, and domesticity. Each dynasty brought changes to these roles, reflecting shifts in governance, economy, and cultural values. Confucianism played a defining role in shaping gender roles. The doctrine of the three obediences and four virtues dictated that a woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son in widowhood. Women were expected to uphold family honor through chastity, diligence, and silence. Laws and customs reinforced these expectations, making it difficult for women to step beyond their prescribed roles. Yet, despite these restrictions, women found ways to exert influence. Some became scholars, poets, and strategists, using their intellect to navigate societal constraints. Others played crucial roles in economic activities, working in agriculture, textiles, and trade. In royal courts, empresses and consorts influenced policies and wielded power behind the throne. Understanding the history of women in ancient China provides valuable insight into the country's broader cultural and social evolution. Some eras, like the Tang Dynasty, brought greater freedoms, while others, like the Qing Dynasty, imposed even stricter limitations. But across all these periods, one thing remained constant: the resilience of women. Now, let's travel back to one of China's earliest civilizations, the Shang Dynasty, where the first traces of female power and influence began to emerge. The Shang Dynasty, one of China's earliest recorded civilizations, was a time when women held more influence than in later dynasties. Unlike the rigid patriarchal structures that would come to dominate Chinese society, Shang culture had strong matrilineal roots. Family lineage and inheritance were often traced through the mother's side, allowing noble women to wield authority, manage households, and even participate in state affairs. Some royal women played key roles in politics, military leadership, and religious ceremonies. Though kings were the official rulers, their queens and consorts often held substantial power behind the throne, shaping political decisions and strengthening alliances through strategic marriages. One of the most remarkable women of this era was Fu Hao. She was not only a queen but also a military commander and high priestess. As the wife of King Wu Ding, Fu Hao led armies into battle, conducted diplomatic missions, and performed state rituals. Her influence was undeniable, and archaeological discoveries from her tomb confirm her extraordinary status. Inside, bronze weapons, jade ornaments, and thousands of oracle bones were found, clear evidence of her military and spiritual significance. Religious ceremonies were central to Shang society, and women played a major role in ancestral worship and divination. The Shang believed that harmony with the spirit world was essential for prosperity, and royal women acted as intermediaries between the living and the ancestors. They conducted elaborate rituals, seeking guidance from the gods on matters of war, agriculture, and governance. Oracle bones, turtle shells, and animal bones used for divination provide some of the earliest written records of Chinese history. These inscriptions mention female warriors, priestesses, and royal consorts, proving that noble women were not confined to domestic roles, but were actively involved in state affairs. For common women, however, life was much more restricted. While noble women could exercise influence, most women were engaged in farming, textile production, and household labor. Many worked in silk weaving, an industry that would later become a cornerstone of China's economy. Their contributions were vital, but their status remained lower than that of their noble counterparts. The Shang Dynasty stands out as a rare period in Chinese history when noble women could hold political, military, and religious authority. But with the dynasty's fall and the rise of the Zhou dynasty, these freedoms would gradually erode. Confucian ideals would soon reshape gender roles, setting the stage for centuries of changing expectations for women. The Zhou dynasty marked a turning point in the roles of women in Chinese society. While noble women in the Shang dynasty had enjoyed some degree of power and influence, the rise of Confucianism during the Zhou period introduced stricter expectations for female behavior. Confucius emphasized a structured, hierarchical society where harmony depended on well-defined relationships, especially within the family. For women, this meant increased subordination. The 3 obediences and 4 virtues became the guiding principles of female life. A woman was expected to obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son in widowhood. She was judged by her morality, proper speech, modest appearance, and diligent work. These ideals placed women firmly in the domestic sphere, limiting their autonomy and reinforcing the belief that their greatest duty was to their family. The Zhou dynasty also solidified the patriarchal family structure. A man's status was reflected in the number of wives and concubines he had, as polygamy was common among the elite. The primary wife held the highest rank in the household and was responsible for managing family affairs and producing a male heir. Concubines, while socially inferior, could rise in status if they bore sons. However, their position remained unstable, as they were subject to the power of the primary wife and the whims of their husband. Daughters were often viewed as financial burdens, since they would eventually marry into another family and could not continue their own family's lineage. Many were married off at a young age in arranged unions that benefited their fathers and brothers. Their primary role was to bear children and maintain household harmony. Despite their limited public roles, women played an essential part in religious rituals and ancestral worship, which were central to Zhou society. Maintaining the connection between the living and the dead was believed to ensure the family's prosperity. Women, particularly wives and mothers, were responsible for conducting household ceremonies, preparing offerings, and teaching their children the importance of honoring their ancestors. For noble women, influence was still possible but restricted. Some managed estates, advised their husbands, or acted as regents in times of crisis. However, these instances were rare, and the overall trend was one of declining female autonomy. The Zhou dynasty's emphasis on Confucian values reinforced the idea that a woman's place was in the home, devoted to her family and submissive to male authority. As the dynasty fell and China entered the Warring States period, these rigid gender norms remained deeply ingrained. The expectation that women should be obedient, modest, and devoted to their families would continue to shape Chinese society for centuries to come. The Qin Dynasty, though short-lived, brought dramatic changes to Chinese society. Founded by Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, the dynasty was built on legalist principles, a strict, authoritarian philosophy that prioritized state control and rigid laws over traditional Confucian values. For women, this meant a further decline in status. Unlike Confucianism, which acknowledged a woman's moral influence within the household, legalism saw women as tools for maintaining social order. The state demanded absolute obedience from all subjects, and this extended to gender roles. Women were expected to serve their husbands, produce children, especially sons for labor and military service, and remain silent and submissive. Before the Qin dynasty, noble women often held significant power as consorts, advisors, or even military leaders. However, Qin Shi Huang's centralization efforts stripped them of much of their influence. He abolished regional feudal lords and consolidated power under the emperor, weakening aristocratic families and leaving noble women with little opportunity for political maneuvering. Unlike in the Han and Tang dynasties, where imperial women occasionally played major roles in governance, Qin noblewomen were largely confined to the palace, their roles limited to producing heirs and performing ceremonial duties. For peasant women, life under Qin rule was especially harsh. The empire's massive infrastructure projects, including the Great Wall of China and extensive road systems, required enormous amounts of labor. While men were conscripted for military service and forced labor, women were left to manage farms, care for children, and meet heavy tax quotas. legalist policies imposed severe punishments for even minor infractions. If a woman failed to meet household production requirements or broke any law, intentionally or not, she could face brutal penalties, including corporal punishment or enslavement. Unlike in previous dynasties, where some women could rise in status through family connections, social mobility under the Qin was nearly impossible. Despite these hardships, women remained vital to the empire's economy. They worked in textile production, agriculture, and domestic industries, ensuring the survival of their families, even as the government demanded increasingly harsh labor and taxation. The Qin dynasty set a precedent for strict control over women's lives, reinforcing their subordinate position in both noble and common households. While the dynasty's legal system brought order and efficiency, it also left little room for female agency. However, with the fall of the Qin and the rise of the Han Dynasty, Confucian ideals would return, bringing both new restrictions and new opportunities for women in Chinese society. The Han Dynasty, a period of great prosperity and expansion, solidified Confucianism as the dominant ideology in China. This had a profound and lasting impact on women's lives, shaping their roles and expectations for centuries to come. Under Confucian principles, a woman's value was measured by her obedience, virtue, and dedication to her family. One of the most influential texts on women's roles emerged during this period, Lessons for Women by Ban Zhou. Ban Zhou, a scholar and historian, was one of the most respected women of her time. In her work, she emphasized humility, obedience, and devotion as the ideal qualities of a woman. She advised women to accept their subordinate role, but also encouraged them to pursue education, not to challenge men, but to better serve their families. Though her teachings reinforced patriarchal norms, they also acknowledged the importance of women's moral influence within the household. The Confucian doctrine of the 3 obediences and 4 virtues became the standard for women's behavior. A woman must obey her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son in widowhood. She must embody morality, proper speech, modest appearance, and diligent work. These principles confined women to the domestic sphere, where their primary duties were to bear children, manage the household, and maintain family honor. While noble women sometimes wielded influence, most women were expected to be submissive and service-oriented. Despite these restrictions, the Han Dynasty saw an increase in literacy and education for upper-class women. Some elite families recognized that an educated woman could better fulfill her role in managing the household, raising virtuous sons, and preserving family traditions. Ban Zhou herself was a product of this environment, completing her brother's historical work, the Book of Han. Other aristocratic women engaged in literature, poetry, and philosophy, though always within the limits of Confucian expectations. At the imperial court, some empresses and consorts exercised considerable political influence. One of the most notable was Empress Lu Ji, the wife of Emperor Gaozu. After his death, she took control as regent, ruling with ruthless efficiency. She eliminated political rivals and consolidated power, proving that even within a patriarchal system, ambitious women could shape history. Other imperial consorts also played key roles in court intrigues, succession struggles, and governance. Though they operated behind the scenes, these women demonstrated that power was not entirely out of reach. For lower-class women, life remained centered on physical labor. They worked in agriculture, textile production, and domestic industries. Their contributions were essential to sustaining both their families and the economy, yet they had little social mobility or recognition. The Han Dynasty set the foundation for the Confucian expectations of women that would last for centuries. Ban Zhao's teachings, the emphasis on female virtue, and the political maneuvering of empresses all shaped the complex role of women in Chinese society. While Confucian ideals reinforced strict gender roles, they also highlighted the importance of women as moral guides within the family. As the Han Dynasty fell and China entered a period of fragmentation, these gender expectations persisted, setting the stage for the next great era of Chinese civilization. The Tang Dynasty is often considered a golden age for women in Chinese history. Unlike earlier dynasties, where Confucian values strictly confined women to domestic roles, Tang society was more open and dynamic, allowing women greater personal freedom, educational opportunities, and even political influence. This era saw the rise of Empress Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as an emperor, along with many noble women who played key roles in governance, literature, and the arts. Even common women enjoyed more freedom in daily life compared to previous periods, contributing to the economy, social life, and cultural developments. Tang women had greater mobility and independence than those of earlier and later dynasties. Unlike the rigid restrictions that came with Confucianism's dominance in later centuries, Tang women could own property and inherit wealth, participate in social gatherings and religious activities, engage in horseback riding, polo, and other sports traditionally reserved for men. This social openness allowed aristocratic women to pursue education, poetry, music, and even political influence. One of the most remarkable figures of the Tang dynasty was Wu Zetian. She began as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, later became the wife of his successor, Emperor Gaozong, and eventually declared herself Emperor of China, founding her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, before the Tang was restored. Wu Zetian's reign was highly controversial, but it brought significant achievements. She reformed the government, promoting capable officials based on merit rather than aristocratic birth. She expanded the empire's influence, strengthening diplomatic ties with Central Asia. She championed Buddhism, supporting the religion's growth while also using it to legitimize her rule. Despite her strong leadership, later Confucian historians painted her as a ruthless ruler who disrupted traditional gender roles. However, her legacy remains one of intelligence, political skill, and unprecedented female power. Beyond Wu Zetian, many Tang noblewomen played active roles in politics, literature, and cultural life. Women from aristocratic families were often well-educated, composing poetry, music, and calligraphy. One of the most famous female poets of the era was Shui Tao, who was highly respected for her literary talent and became a recognized figure in court culture. Women participated in literary salons, wrote poetry, and exchanged intellectual ideas with men, an unusual level of engagement compared to earlier and later periods. Common women also experienced a level of freedom that was rare in Chinese history. Many worked in trade, textile production, farming, and household industries. Unlike later dynasties that kept women strictly at home, Tang women were often seen running shops, inns, and small businesses. While arranged marriages were still common, divorce and remarriage were more accepted than in later periods, giving women more control over their personal lives. The Tang dynasty stands out as one of the most progressive periods for women in Chinese history. While still living in a patriarchal society, women had greater freedom in movement, marriage, and expression. Wu Zetian proved that a woman could rule a vast empire, while noble women contributed to the flourishing arts and culture. However, after the fall of the Tang dynasty, Confucian ideals regained dominance, and restrictions on women's roles increased in later dynasties, especially with the rise of foot binding and Neo-Confucianism in the Song period. The Song dynasty marked a significant decline in female freedom as society became increasingly governed by Confucian ideals. While the Tang dynasty had allowed women greater mobility, social engagement, and even political influence, the Song period saw the rise of Neo-Confucianism, which reinforced strict gender roles and imposed new restrictions on women's lives. One of the most damaging legacies of this era was the widespread practice of foot binding. Initially emerging among elite courtesans in the late Tang dynasty, foot binding became a cultural expectation for upper-class women during the Song period. Girls as young as 5 had their feet tightly bound to create the highly prized lotus feet, no longer than 3 or 4 inches. This practice severely limited women's mobility, confining them to domestic spaces. Reinforced female dependence on male family members, became a prerequisite for marriage, as bound feet were considered a sign of beauty, status, and obedience. Though foot binding was most common among the elite, it eventually spread to the middle class. Some lower-class women remained unbound so they could continue working in fields or labor-intensive jobs, but the ideal of the immobile, delicate woman became dominant in Song culture. The rise of Neo-Confucianism further restricted women's roles. Scholars such as Zhou emphasize strict social order, reinforcing the 3 obediences and 4 virtues. Women were expected to remain chaste and loyal to their husbands, be obedient to male authority at all stages of life, dedicate themselves to household duties and child rearing. Unlike in previous dynasties, where some noble women could exert political influence, Song-era women had almost no role in governance. The ideal woman was one who maintained her virtue in silence and seclusion. Widow chastity became highly valued, with some women choosing to remain unmarried for life rather than remarry after a husband's death. Over time, extreme acts of widow loyalty, including suicide, were even celebrated as acts of virtue. Despite these restrictions, women remained essential to the economy, particularly in silk production. They played a vital role in sericulture, raising silkworms and extracting silk threads, weaving, spinning, and embroidering fine textiles, running household businesses, such as managing shops or engaging in small-scale trade. Although their labor was crucial to the economy, women's contributions were largely unrecognized, as Confucian values prioritized men's work in government, scholarship, and military service. A few educated women found ways to make their voices heard. Some aristocratic women received private tutoring in poetry, calligraphy, and philosophy, though their intellectual pursuits were limited compared to men. One of the most famous female writers of the Song Dynasty was Li Qingzhao, a poet known for her deeply emotional verses. She wrote about love, loss, war, and the struggles of women living under restrictive norms. Her work provided rare insights into the realities of female life during this period. The Song Dynasty was a turning point for women, but not for the better. The spread of foot binding, the dominance of Neo-Confucian ideals, and the increasing restriction of female mobility created a rigid, patriarchal society that shaped gender norms for centuries. While women continued to contribute to literature, philosophy, and the economy, their roles became increasingly confined to the domestic sphere. The relative freedoms of the Tang dynasty were replaced by stricter social expectations, setting the stage for even harsher restrictions in later dynasties. The Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols, brought dramatic cultural shifts to China, including changes in the status and roles of women. Unlike the preceding Song dynasty, which confined women under Neo-Confucian ideals, the Mongol rulers introduced more flexible gender norms, particularly among the upper classes. Mongol customs differed significantly from traditional Han Chinese practices. Mongol women rode horses and participated in hunting and archery, managed family affairs, including economic and political decisions while their husbands were at war, had greater mobility and fewer restrictions on public participation. When the Mongols established the Yuan dynasty, some of these customs influenced elite Chinese women. Compared to the highly secluded Song women, Yuan noble women had more opportunities to travel and engage in politics, less emphasis on foot binding, as Mongols did not practice it, a greater role in business, managing estates and overseeing trade. However, these freedoms were largely limited to the upper classes. Mongol customs did not completely erase Confucian gender norms, and most Han Chinese women remained under traditional patriarchal structures. One of the biggest changes under Mongol rule was the expansion of trade. The Yuan dynasty actively promoted commerce, banking, and international exchanges, allowing women to participate in ways that had been discouraged in earlier dynasties. Women became involved in running shops, inns, and textile businesses, weaving and producing silk, one of China's most valuable exports, managing agricultural estates, and overseeing livestock. Some Chinese women also played roles in financial management, as the Mongols encouraged a market-based economy. The Silk Road flourished under Mongol rule, and women in wealthy merchant families often helped oversee trade transactions. Despite these economic opportunities, peasant women in rural areas saw little change. They remained tied to agricultural labor, household duties, and local markets, continuing the cycle of hardship and low social status. The Yuan dynasty highlighted a stark divide between elite and lower-class women. Mongol noblewomen, and even some Han Chinese aristocrats, enjoyed a level of independence that had not been seen since the Tang dynasty. Some noble women commanded armies, held land, and participated in court politics. Empresses and princesses were active in governance, and women from influential families had more authority than their Song-era counterparts. One notable figure was Empress Chabi, the wife of Kublai Khan. She played a crucial role in court politics, promoting Buddhism and fostering diplomatic relations with the conquered Han Chinese. Her influence shaped many of the cultural and religious policies of Kublai Khan's reign. In contrast, peasant women remained in traditional, labor-heavy roles. They worked in farming, harvesting crops and raising livestock, domestic labor, serving wealthier families, textile production, spinning silk and weaving cloth for trade. While Mongol customs offered more freedoms to elite women, they did little to improve the lives of lower-class women who continued to struggle under economic and social hardships. The Yuan dynasty was a time of contrasts for women. While Mongol noblewomen retained significant influence, most Han Chinese women remained bound by Confucian traditions. The Mongols did not enforce Confucian gender restrictions as strictly as previous dynasties, but their rule was short-lived. When the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Yuan, many of the old Confucian ideals of female obedience and seclusion returned, leading to greater restrictions on women in the following era. During the Ming Dynasty, the lives of women became more restricted than ever before. After the relative openness of the Yuan dynasty, Confucian traditions returned in full force, shaping strict expectations for female behavior. Women were expected to remain within the household, dedicating themselves to family duties and avoiding any form of public life. Morality, obedience, and chastity became the defining virtues of a woman's existence. A young girl was taught from childhood that her purpose was to serve, first her father, then her husband, and finally her son. Foot binding, once a practice of the elite, became nearly universal, further limiting women's mobility and reinforcing their dependence on male relatives. For many, it was not just a beauty standard, but an unspoken rule of society. Widowhood took on a new meaning during this time. A woman who lost her husband was expected to remain loyal to his memory, never remarrying, no matter how young she was. She was praised for a life of sacrifice, devoting herself to her children and her late husband's family. Some widows chose a path of extreme devotion, starving themselves or even taking their own lives to preserve their honor. The state rewarded such acts, and communities built temples in their memory, turning them into symbols of virtue. Yet, despite these strict limitations, women remained vital to the survival of society. They worked in silk weaving, embroidery, pottery, and tea production, industries that sustained households and fueled the economy. Their labor was essential, but their contributions remained largely invisible, overshadowed by Confucian ideals that prioritized male achievements. Some women, however, found ways to leave their mark. Behind closed doors, a few pursued literature, poetry, and the arts. Calligraphers and painters created works of beauty, though their names were often hidden, their talents attributed to fathers or husbands. Shui Susu, one of the most renowned women of her time, defied expectations through her poetry and artistry. She was a rare exception in a world that sought to silence female voices. The Ming Dynasty was an era of contradictions. Women were bound by tradition, yet they persevered. They were confined to their homes, yet their work sustained entire industries. They were told their greatest virtue was obedience, yet some still found ways to express themselves. But as the Ming Dynasty fell and the Qing Dynasty rose, these restrictions would not disappear. Instead, they would reach their peak, before the first sparks of change would begin to flicker. During the Qing Dynasty, the expectations placed on women reached their strictest point. Confucian ideals, which had long dictated female behavior, became deeply entrenched in society. A woman's life was defined by duty, obedience, and sacrifice. She was expected to serve her father in childhood, her husband in marriage, and her son in widowhood. Her world was the household, and her purpose was to uphold the family's honor. Foot binding, already widespread in previous dynasties, became nearly inescapable for upper-class women. Tiny bound feet were seen as the ultimate sign of beauty and virtue, ensuring a woman's dependence on her male relatives. It was not just a practice, it was a statement, a symbol of submission and refinement. Widow chastity, once encouraged, was now fiercely enforced. A woman whose husband had died was expected to remain unmarried for life. The most virtuous among them endured hardship, poverty, and even starvation rather than remarry. Some took their devotion to the extreme, ending their own lives to prove their loyalty. These acts were celebrated, with families erecting memorial arches and the government granting official honors to those who chose death over remarriage. Women's lives were more restricted than ever, but beneath the surface, change was beginning to stir. Among the lower classes, economic necessity made strict Confucian ideals harder to maintain. While wealthy women remained secluded, peasant women continued to work in the fields, raise livestock, and contribute to family businesses. In some cases, bound feet were abandoned, as laboring families could not afford to cripple their daughters. Meanwhile, in the shadows of society, women were beginning to take on new roles. The late Qing period was marked by rebellion, and in these uprisings, some women stepped forward. In the Taiping Rebellion, they fought alongside men, breaking centuries-old traditions. In the Boxer Rebellion, women joined the resistance against foreign influence, showing that even in the strictest of times, they were capable of shaping history. Education also became a force for change. By the late Qing Dynasty, the first schools for girls were being established, breaking centuries of tradition that denied women formal learning. A new generation of educated women emerged, questioning the old ways and seeking a different future. One of the most influential voices of this time was Chu Jin, a writer, revolutionary, and outspoken critic of women's oppression. She called for an end to foot binding, the right to education, and greater freedom for women. Though her activism led to her execution, her ideas planted the seeds of change that would grow in the years to come. The Qing Dynasty was both an end and a beginning. It was the final chapter of imperial China, a time when Confucian ideals reached their peak, binding women to the strictest expectations. But it was also the moment when cracks began to form, when women began to push back, to fight, to dream of something more. As the dynasty collapsed and China entered the modern era, the role of women would never be the same again. The traditions that had shaped their lives for centuries were beginning to unravel, and the struggle for a new future had begun. The story of women in ancient China is one of endurance, strength, and quiet defiance. Across dynasties, they lived under the weight of tradition, confined by rules that dictated how they should behave, who they should serve, and what their futures could be. Yet even within these limits, they found ways to shape history. They were warriors, scholars, artists, and rulers. Some, like Fu Hao and Wu Zetian, broke barriers and seized power in a world dominated by men. Others, like Ban Zhao and Li Qingzhao, left their mark through words, preserving their thoughts in ink when their voices could not be heard. Countless more, women whose names history has forgotten, worked in fields, wove silk, raised children, and held their families together, ensuring the survival of an empire. At times, they enjoyed freedom, riding horses in the Tang Dynasty, running businesses in the Yuan, or receiving an education in the late Qing. But often their lives were marked by restriction. Confined to the household, their feet bound, their futures determined not by their own desires, but by the men around them. Yet they adapted, they resisted, they endured. As the Qing Dynasty fell and China moved into the modern age, the struggles of these women paved the way for change. Foot binding would be abandoned. Education would become a right. Women would take their place in movements that would shape the nation's future. The story of women in ancient China is not just a tale of oppression. It is a story of resilience, a story of transformation, a story of those who, even in the most difficult of times, found ways to leave their mark on history, and their legacy still echoes today. For more details on this topic, check out the corresponding article on our website. You can find the link in the description below. Thanks for watching.